Hey guys, it's Shara from Woodshop Diaries, and I've been getting a lot of questions lately about what tools that I'm using and what my method is for cutting down my full sheets of plywood when I build furniture. So I thought that would be a good topic to cover in a quick video. So let's get started. So first things first, set up your plywood on some sacrificial scrap blocks, whether it be, like I said, on your workbench, on your sawhorses, or on your floor. Get you some scrap blocks underneath it. You can use a table saw to cut down your full sheets of plywood, but for me, it's a lot easier, I think, and safer to use a circular saw. So that's what I do. So I use an Accu-Cut for cross cuts. So when I'm cutting my plywood across the grain or cutting my pieces to length. And then I use this Rip Cut for cutting my plywood strips to the right width that I want. So for ripping my sheets of plywood. Now, one thing to note is I have two circular saws in my shop, and I use this one specifically for cutting plywood. So I always keep a fine finish plywood blade in this saw. I also always keep this blue cutting sled that's used with this guide, and it's also interchangeable with that guide. I always keep this attached to this circular saw, and it's adjusted so that it is perfectly, accurately lined up on this guide and that guide. So when possible, I know it's not always feasible, but when possible, I highly recommend that once you get this blue sled set up on this saw, don't take it off. When you take it off and put it back on, you have the tendency to not put it on in the exact same place it was before, and your cuts can be inaccurate, or you have to reset up everything every time that you use it. So if possible, I highly recommend having a designated circular saw with this sled always attached, ready to cut your plywood. So if you are new to the Kreg Rip Cut and Accu-Cut and are interested in how this is set up, basically this blue sled is interchangeable with both guides. So you simply slide your circular saw base into the sled, and you use a screwdriver and these set screws right here to lock it in place. Now the key here is making sure that your circular saw is in here square. So it doesn't need to be crooked or it'll make your cuts inaccurate. There's a little tab right here with a little red line, and it'll go onto that Rip Cut cutting guide, and you'll line up that red line with the distance that you want your width of your Rip Cut to be. So this is adjustable. So once you get this blue sled set up on your Accu-Cut, you put this onto your Rip Cut guide, and you can measure between the blade and the guide, and then adjust this little red lever so that it reads the correct distance, and then you're set up and good to go. Now, all of these instructions are included with these tools, so always follow manufacturer's instructions when setting this up. But that's just a quick rundown of how these work. Now that my circular saw is ready to go, I've got my plywood blade in and my sled is on and is set up correctly to use with these tools. The first thing that I usually do is rip my plywood to the lengths, or to the widths that I want. So widths first, lengths second. Now, it doesn't have to be that way, that's just what I do personally. So I lock on my Rip Cut cutting guide and I start ripping. In this case, I'm ripping some bookshelf sides, so I want to rip them to 11 inches wide. So I've got my Rip Cut set up so that I'm cutting 11 inches wide. All I do is line up my guide right here on the edge of this plywood and rip all the way down from one end to the other. I forgot to cover the cutting depth. So this is a 3/4 inch sheet of plywood. With my sled on, because the thickness of the sled will affect the depth of your cut. So with the sled on, I place it onto my sheet of plywood on the edge. I lift the blade guard, and then I see where my blade is, and I simply adjust the height of my blade so that it cuts about 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch lower than my plywood sheet. that's how I rip my plywood. Now, what about crosscuts? So crosscuts are when you cut across the grain. So basically when you cut a piece of plywood to a specific length versus width. Now, for plywood crosscuts, if my plywood piece is less than 16 inches wide, I use my miter saw. I've got a miter saw that's capable of cutting 16-inch wide boards. So it's quickest to use my miter saw if the piece is under 16 inches. However, if the piece is over 16 inches wide, I like to use my Kreg Accu-Cut. So I'll show you how I use that now. Here I've got a 24-inch wide piece that I cannot cut on my miter saw in one pass. So it's easiest for me in this case to use my Accu-Cut to cross cut this board where I need it. So the first thing that I do is measure. I need this piece cut at 31 inches, so I measure and mark 31 inches on both ends of the board. Then I use a square to just make a bigger mark. And I can take this cutting sled right off the rip cut and it'll slide right onto the Accu-Cut. Before cutting anything, when you're cross-cutting a piece like this, you need to make sure that it's supported underneath, because if you just had the sawhorses on one on each end of the board when you started cutting, this would sag, pinch the blade, and could cause kickback. Make sure that the underside of where you're going to be cross-cutting is supported. Now the Accu-Cut is designed so that it doesn't have to be clamped in place. It's got these black rubber strips right here that will set down on the plywood and it will grip it just with the friction between the rubber and the plywood. So I just make sure that the dust is out of the way and the dust is wiped off my Accu-Cut. And I line the edge of my Accu-Cut up with the lines that I marked with my square. Then I just double check that it is indeed square. And I make sure that my Accu-Cut is on the good side of the board so that my curved cut will be on the waist side of the board, so I will actually get the 31 inches total that I want to get out of this board. So all I do, slide this on the track and start cutting. And I have my 31-inch by 24-inch wide piece cut. And it's that easy. Cutting down plywood doesn't have to be such a daunting task. All you need is a couple of good guides for ripping and cross-cutting your plywood sheets. Also, a few frequently asked questions that I get about the tools that I'm using are how accurate are they? Honestly, I've had really good luck using mine, but the key in using both of these guides are to make sure that everything is tight, all the set screws are tight, and that you check for square. So if something comes unsquare or it gets loose, you should expect that you'll have inaccurate cuts. And another question I get asked a lot is, does the Accu-Cut really stay in place? Yes, the Accu-Cut really stays in place on its own. You don't have to clamp it. You can if you want, but you don't have to. Just make sure that you wipe the dust away from the rubber and you wipe your dust off your plywood before you place it on. So the dust will not allow it to grip very well, but as long as you kind of wipe the dust away, it should grip fine on its own. You shouldn't have to hold it, clamp it. It should be fine. One thing to note too on the Accu-Cut is that this piece right here, there's a little lip. When you place it on your plywood surface, you should slide it up so that that lip is against the plywood. So that holds it from sliding forward when you're cutting. I hope that that's answered most of the questions. If you have more, let me know in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe if you aren't already, and I will leave links to all the products used in case you're interested in the description below. Also, there's a blog post link in the description below as well if you want more details and some step-by-step written tutorial and explanation. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope it's been helpful. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, happy building.